They thought I would always be there to fix their problems. So I disappeared, without warning, and let them learn the hard way. I'm sorry, sir, but this gala is for the elite. Those who smell of grease and old age belong at the service entrance, not the ballroom. These words didn't come from a stranger, but from a young man in a tuxedo that cost more than a year's rent. A man whose very name was carved into the granite of the mountain we stood upon. It is a peculiar thing, isn't it? My friends, how the modern world forgets that the tallest skyscrapers are built on foundations they never see. I have lived 72 years on this earth, and if there is one thing I have learned, it is that the loudest voices in the room are often the ones with the least to say. And the most expensive suits often hide the cheapest souls. Tonight, I want to tell you a story about a man named Elias, a man who spent 40 years being the heartbeat of an empire, only to be treated like a broken gear in a machine he helped build. The setting was the Grand Alpine Estate, a fortress of glass and steel perched precariously over the Swiss clouds. It was the 100th anniversary of the von Steiger Corporation, a name synonymous with European precision, logistics, and wealth. The air was thin and crisp, smelling of expensive pine and even more expensive perfume. Hundreds of luxury sedans and sports cars snaked up the mountain pass, their headlights cutting through the mist like searching eyes. Inside, the champagne flowed like a golden river, and the diamonds worn by the guests outshone the stars above. It was a world of absolute perfection, or so it seemed to those who only looked at the surface. In the middle of this shimmering sea of vanity stood Elias, wearing a wool coat that had seen better decades and boots that had walked every square inch of the company's factories since the days of the founding grandfather. Elias wasn't there to celebrate. He was there because, for 40 years, when something broke, Elias fixed it. When a contract was stalled by a stubborn local official in the valley, Elias knew which vintage of wine would open the door. When the massive, automated sorting systems in the Rhine Valley seized up at 3 in the morning, Elias was the only one who knew which lever to pull and which bolt to tighten. He was the invisible pillar, the man who stayed in the shadows, so the heirs could stand in the light. But tonight, the lights were too bright, and the heirs Julian and Beatrice had forgotten that shadows are what give a landscape its depth. They saw an old man with calloused hands and a faded coat, and they felt a sudden, sharp pang of embarrassment that such a relic was associated with their brand. "Look at him," Julian whispered to his sister, his voice dripping with a disdain that only comes from inherited wealth. "He's standing right by the main entrance. The international investors from London and Tokyo are arriving any minute. He looks like a beggar who wandered in from the woods. Why hasn't security moved him?" Julian was 32, with hair perfectly gelled and a heart that had never known the weight of a tool. To him, Elias was a ghost of a past he wanted to bury. A past where the company actually made things with hands, rather than just moving numbers on a screen. He stepped forward, his leather shoes clicking sharply on the marble floor. A sound that signaled the beginning of a storm Elias had seen brewing for years. "Elias," Julian said, not as a greeting, but as a challenge. He didn't offer a hand. He offered a sneer. "What are you doing here? This is a black tie event. You look like you've just finished digging a ditch. The service entrance is 3 miles down the service road. I suggest you find it before you start scaring the guests." Elias looked at the young man, his eyes calm and deep as a mountain lake. He didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He simply reached into his pocket and felt the cold, heavy weight of a master key. A key that had opened every door in the von Steiger empire since Julian's grandfather had handed it to him 40 years ago. "The cooling system in the server room is vibrating." "Julian," Elias said softly, "it's a harmonic resonance. If you don't adjust the secondary baffles, the whole network will overheat before the main toast." Julian laughed, a harsh, brittle sound that drew the attention of several nearby socialites. "A harmonic resonance. Listen to you. We have a state-of-the-art AI-driven climate control system monitored from a hub in Zurich. We don't need old-world intuition anymore. Elias, we need prestige. We need people who fit the image of the future. And frankly, your image is dragging us back into the 1970s. You're a handyman, not an engineer. Actually, let's be honest. You're a janitor with a fancy title. I want you off the property. Now, if I see you on the security cameras in 5 minutes, I'll have you removed for trespassing." The crowd around them went silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy and suffocating. People looked away, some in pity, some in agreement. But no one spoke up for the old man. Beatrice joined her brother, her silk dress rustling like a snake in the grass. "He's right, Elias. We've already signed the paperwork for your retirement. Your pension will be handled by the legal department eventually. There's no need for you to be here. The world has moved on. We don't need someone who talks to machines. We have software that does that for us. Go back to your cottage in the valley. Drink your schnapps. fade away gracefully. She spoke to him as if he were a disobedient child, or perhaps a pet that had lived past its usefulness. The cruelty was casual, the kind of institutionalized arrogance that assumes everyone who doesn't possess power is beneath notice. Elias felt a flicker of something in his chest, not anger, but a profound, weary disappointment. He remembered Julian as a boy, crying when he fell off his bike, and how Elias had been the one to patch the tire and the knee while the father was away on business. He remembered Beatrice's first car, and how he had spent all night in the garage making sure the brakes were perfect because he didn't trust the factory specs. He had been the silent guardian of their lives, and now, they were casting him out because his presence didn't match the aesthetic of their success. It is a bitter pill to swallow. My friends, when you realize that the people you protected are the ones who will throw you to the wolves the moment they feel safe. I understand, Elias said, his voice steady and devoid of the bitterness they expected. He didn't beg for his job. He didn't remind them of the times he had saved the company from bankruptcy by fixing the very machines they now mocked. He simply unbuttoned his coat, reached into the inner pocket, and pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger. It was filled with 40 years of handwritten notes, pressures, temperatures, codes, and the personality of an empire that lived in the wires and the pipes. He looked at it for a moment, then closed it firmly. The world has indeed changed. You believe that because you can see the data. You understand the machine. But data is just a shadow. You don't know the heart of this place. The guests were beginning to murmur now. Sensing the drama, a group of investors from London, led by a man named Sir Alistair, approached the group. Julian immediately put on his CEO mask, a plastic smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ah, Sir Alistair, my apologies for the interruption. Just dealing with some legacy issues. This man was just leaving." Sir Alistair looked at Elias, then at Julian, his expression unreadable. He had been doing business with the von Steigers for decades, and he knew that the quality of their work had always been miraculously consistent. He didn't know Elias's face, but he knew the results of his labor. Legacy is what we're here to celebrate, isn't it? Julian, Sir Alistair remarked, his British accent sharp and refined. He glanced at Elias's boots. Those look like the boots of a man who knows where the bodies are buried, or at least, where the pipes lead. Julian laughed nervously, ushering the investors toward the bar. Exactly. And we're burying the old ways tonight. We're moving into a fully automated, cloud-based era. No more human error. No more. Grease. He shot one last, venomous look at Elias over his shoulder, a silent command to disappear. Elias stood alone for a moment in the center of the foyer. The music began to swell, a digital symphony that sounded cold and hollow to his ears. He looked up at the ceiling, at the intricate network of vents and sensors that Julian was so proud of. He knew that beneath the polished floor, the cooling pumps were already beginning to struggle with the heat of 500 bodies and the massive computing power required for the night's holographic displays. He could feel the vibration through the soles of his boots, a tiny, rhythmic shudder that told him the harmonic resonance he had mentioned was real, and it was growing. He could have fixed it in 10 minutes, with a wrench and a bit of intuition. He could have saved them. Instead, Elias turned toward the exit. He didn't go to the service door. He walked straight through the main entrance, pushing past the influencers who were busy taking selfies against the backdrop of the mountains. He stepped out into the freezing night air, the wind whipping his white hair across his forehead. He felt a strange sense of lightness, a freedom he hadn't known in decades. For 40 years, the weight of the von Steiger empire had rested on his shoulders. He had been the one who didn't sleep so they could dream. He had been the one who stayed in the basement so they could live in the penthouse. He walked to his old, rusted pickup truck, the only vehicle in the parking lot that wasn't worth 100,000 euros. He climbed inside, the engine groaning as it turned over. A familiar, honest sound. As he put the truck into gear, he looked back at the glowing glass palace on the cliff. He knew exactly what was going to happen. He knew that within 2 hours, the systems would begin to fail. He knew that the cloud-based safety protocols wouldn't recognize the physical vibration in the pipes. He knew that the Empire was about to learn a very expensive lesson about the value of the people they chose to ignore. But more than that, Elias knew something Julian and Beatrice didn't. He knew that he wasn't just the handyman. He knew the contents of a certain safe deposit box in Zurich. A box that contained a document signed by the founding grandfather in a moment of clarity and gratitude 20 years ago. The heirs thought they were the masters of the house, but they were merely the tenants of a man they had just insulted. As Elias drove down the winding mountain road, leaving the lights of the gala behind, he didn't feel like a victim. He felt like a man who had finally decided to let the world see what happens when the invisible pillar decides to stop holding everything up. The road was dark, and the snow began to fall in heavy, silent flakes, covering the tracks of his truck as if erasing his existence from the mountain. He thought about the pride in Julian's eyes, the kind of pride that precedes a very long, very hard fall. It is a tragic thing, my friends, to see the young burn, the maps their elders drew for them, assuming they no longer need directions because they have a compass on their phone. They don't realize that a compass only tells you where north is. It doesn't tell you where the quicksand is. Elias reached into the glove box and pulled out a small, silver whistle, a gift from the founder. He blew it softly, the sound lost in the wind. The silence that followed was the sound of a legacy ending and a reckoning beginning. He drove past the valley gate, the automated sensors blinking green as they recognized his transponder for the last time. He knew that by tomorrow morning, those sensors would be dead, and the gates would be locked tight, trapping the elite in their mountain prison. He thought about the dignity of labor, the quiet honor of a job well done, and how the modern world has traded that honor for a brand image. He felt a sense of peace. He was going home to his cottage, to his garden, and to a life where he was no longer invisible. He would let them scream into their microphones. He would let them call their technicians in Zurich. He would let them learn the hard way that you can't automate respect, and you can't download a soul. As the truck disappeared into the mist of the lower valley, the first flickering of the lights at the Grand Alpine estate began. It was subtle at first, a slight dimming of the chandeliers, a momentary glitch in the music. The guests didn't notice. They were too busy admiring themselves in the mirrors. But deep in the bowels of the building, the harmonic resonance was reaching its peak. The old bones were gone, and the new world was about to find out just how fragile a house of glass really is. And so, the stage was set for a night that would be remembered, not for its luxury, but for the moment the world realized that the man they called a janitor was actually the only thing keeping the roof from falling in. The story of Elias is a warning to us all, isn't it? We live in an age where we value the new over the true, and the shiny over the sturdy. We look at the elderly and see a burden instead of a library. We look at the worker and see a cost instead of a creator. But the universe has a way of balancing the scales. It has a way of showing us that the people we think we can afford to lose are the very ones we cannot survive without. Elias was gone, and with him, the secret language of the machines had vanished. The heirs were left with their diamonds and their data, standing in a palace that was slowly, silently turning into a tomb of their own making. The silence in the truck was a stark contrast to the thumping bass of the party he'd left behind. Elias looked at his hands in the dim green glow of the dashboard. They were stained with the oil of 1,000 engines, scarred by the heat of 100 boilers. To the heirs, those scars were ugly, a sign of a lower class. To Elias, they were a map of his life, a life spent ensuring that the world around him functioned perfectly. He thought of the grandfather, the man who had started it all in a small workshop in the valley. That man would have stood by Elias tonight. That man understood that a business isn't made of stock options. It's made of people who care enough to get their hands dirty. He reached the end of the mountain road and turned toward the coast. He had a small house there, overlooking the sea, a place he'd bought years ago and never had the time to visit. He'd always been too busy fixing the von Steigers' problems. Tonight, for the first time in 40 years, he had no problems to fix but his own, and his only problem was deciding whether to have tea or wine when he arrived. The mountain was behind him now, a dark silhouette against the winter sky. He knew the phone would start ringing soon. He knew the frantic emails would start flooding his inbox. But he also knew that his phone would be turned off, and his inbox would remain empty. He had given them 40 years. He wouldn't give them another minute. There is a certain beauty in walking away, don't you think? Not in anger, but in clarity, to realize that your value isn't determined by those who are too blind to see it. Elias wasn't running away. He was simply moving to a place where he could finally be seen for who he was, even if the only person watching was the moon over the ocean. Behind him, on the mountain, the first alarm began to chime. A lonely, digital cry for help that no one knew how to answer. The invisible pillar had stepped out, and the weight of the world was finally starting to settle where it belonged, on the shoulders of those who thought they were too important to carry it. The night was just beginning, and the lesson was about to be taught. It would be a cold lesson, a dark lesson, and a lesson that no amount of money could unlearn. As Elias drove toward the sea, he smiled the quiet smile of a man who knew exactly what the morning would bring. The storm was coming, but for the first time in his life, Elias wasn't the one who had to stop it. He was just the man who had walked away and let the rain fall where it may. There is a particular kind of silence that follows a great insult. My friends, it isn't the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a fuse that has already been lit. As Elias drove his rattling pickup truck down the serpentine roads of the Swiss Alps, leaving the glowing fortress of the von Steiger estate behind, he felt that silence deep in his marrow. The young heirs, Julian and Beatrice, believed they had finally purged the old ways from their shiny new world. They thought that by removing the man, they had removed the memory of how things actually worked. But as any of us who have lived through the seasons of life know, you cannot simply delete the foundation and expect the roof to stay in the air. You see, the arrogance of the young often lies in the belief that the world began the day they opened their eyes, and that history is just a series of outdated software updates. Elias gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the worn leather. He looked into the rearview mirror one last time. The estate looked like a crown of diamonds perched on the brow of the mountain. It was beautiful. Yes, but it was a beauty that required constant, invisible labor to maintain. He remembered 30 years ago, when Julian's grandfather, old Maximilian, had stood on that very cliff with a set of blueprints and a dream. Maximilian hadn't been a man of spreadsheets. He was a man of steel and sweat. He had looked at Elias, then a young engineer with grease under his fingernails, and said, "Elias, I can build the walls, but I need you to give this place a soul. I need you to make sure the heart never stops beating, even when the power fails." Elias had taken that charge to heart. He had spent 4 decades learning the language of that house, the way the pipes expanded in the winter, the specific hum of the electrical transformers, and the delicate balance of the pressure valves that kept the mountain's groundwater from flooding the lower levels. Now, that heart was beating alone. On his way out, Elias had made one final stop at the sub-basement maintenance hatch. He didn't sabotage anything. Elias was too honorable a man for petty destruction. He simply removed the temporary bypass he had installed 6 months ago, a hand-carved wooden shim, and a manual override that kept the primary cooling pump from vibrating itself to pieces. He had told Julian 3 times that the pump needed a full industrial overhaul, but the young CEO had told him the budget was being diverted to digital branding and influencer outreach. Julian had laughed, saying the AI sensors would alert them if there was a real problem. Elias had simply replaced the shim, CHID, and kept the system running on hope and expertise. Tonight, he took his shim back. He took his expertise back. He took the soul of the building with him in his pocket, and he let the machines face the reality of their own neglect. Back at the gala, the atmosphere was reaching a fever pitch of self-congratulation. Julian stood on a stage made of reinforced glass, a holographic projection of the company's global vision floating behind him. He held a crystal flute of champagne, his face projected on giant screens for the 500 guests to see. "We are no longer just a logistics company," Julian declared, his voice amplified by a sound system that Elias had personally tuned just 2 days prior. "We are a tech titan. We have moved beyond the era of manual labor and fix-it mentalities. Tonight, we celebrate the complete automation of our Swiss headquarters. Efficiency is our new god, and data is our new currency." The crowd cheered, the sound echoing through the cavernous hall. Beatrice stood off to the side, nodding with a polished smile, her mind already on the retirement party she would throw once they finally sold off the clutter of the old warehouses in the valley. But beneath their feet, the mountain was starting to speak. The harmonic resonance Elias had warned them about was no longer a whisper. It was becoming a rhythmic throb. To the socialites in their silk and sequins, it felt like nothing more than the bass of the DJ's music. But to anyone who had ever held a wrench, it was the sound of a mechanical heart attack. In the server room, tucked deep into the granite of the mountain, the temperature began to climb. 1 degree, 2 degrees, 5 degrees. The AI system, so lauded by Julian, did exactly what it was programmed to do. It detected the heat and increased the fan speed. But the fans were connected to the same vibrating cooling loop. The faster they spun, the more the vibration increased. It was a feedback loop of human arrogance, a digital brain trying to solve a physical problem it couldn't understand. Elias reached the valley floor and pulled over near a small stone bridge. He stepped out of the truck, the cold air hitting his face like a splash of water. He lit a pipe, the smell of cherry tobacco drifting into the night. He looked up at the mountain and waited. He knew the timing better than any computer. He thought about the time Julian was 12 and had accidentally locked himself in the estate's walk-in vault. The electronic keypad had fried during a lightning storm, and the boy was panicking as the oxygen levels dropped. The fire department said it would take 6 hours to drill through. Elias had arrived in 20 minutes, listened to the tumblers with a stethoscope his grandfather had given him, and opened the door in 90 seconds. Julian had hugged him then, sobbing into his grease-stained shirt. Tonight, that same boy had told him he smelled of old age and grease. It is a strange thing. How the hand that saves us is the first one we bite. Once we feel powerful, the first sign of trouble at the gala was subtle. The holographic display behind Julian flickered, a jagged line of static cutting through the sleek Vision logo. Julian frowned but kept talking. Then, the air conditioning vents began to emit a low, mournful whistle. It was a sound like a wounded animal. A few guests looked up, their brows furrowing. Sir Alistair, the veteran investor from London, leaned over to his colleague. "Do you feel that? The floor is shivering." His colleague laughed. "Just the music. Alistair, don't be so old-fashioned. But Sir Alistair had made his fortune in shipping. He knew the feeling of a ship's engine about to blow a gasket. He looked toward the exit, his instincts screaming that the perfect world Julian had described was beginning to fracture. Inside the central hub of the young technicians, Julian had hired men with degrees from the best universities, but no scars on their palms started to panic. Their screens were turning red. "The primary cooling loop is failing," one shouted, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "I'm trying to engage the emergency backup." He clicked a button, but nothing happened. The manual override was gone. The physical lever that Elias used to pull was sitting in a dark corner, disconnected 6 months ago because Julian thought it looked clunky. The computer sent a command to the backup pump, but the backup pump was seized because it hadn't been oiled in 3 years. Elias had offered to do it, but Beatrice had told him the maintenance schedule was now optimized by the cloud. Suddenly, the music stopped, not with a fade, but with a violent, electric pop that sent a shower of sparks from the speakers. The lights dimmed, then surged to a blinding brightness before plunging the entire ballroom into a terrifying, absolute darkness. The emergency lights flickered on a sickly, dim red glow that made the diamonds look like drops of blood. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of 500 people catching their breath. And then, the heat. Without the cooling system, the heat from the massive server racks began to bleed through the floors. The smart glass walls of the estate, designed to tint based on the sun, suddenly turned opaque, trapping everyone inside a black box. Julian's voice came out of the dark, stripped of its bravado. It's just a momentary glitch. Stay calm. The system is resetting." He fumbled for his smartphone, the screen glowing like a lonely candle in the void. He tried to access the building's master controls, but the screen just spun a mocking circle of loading. The network was down. The servers had overheated and shut themselves off to prevent a fire. The future of Global Vision was currently a pile of melting silicon and plastic. Beatrice was screaming at the security guards to open the doors, but the doors were electronic. Without power, the magnetic locks were engaged. They were trapped in their own palace of glass, and the temperature was rising by the minute. Down in the valley, Elias saw the lights of the estate go out. He checked his watch. 2 minutes early, he muttered to himself. The resonance was faster than I thought. He felt no joy in it, only a profound sense of justice. He got back into his truck and continued his drive toward the coast. He knew that Julian would eventually find the old analog phone in the security booth, the one Elias had insisted stay connected to the landline. He knew they would call him, they would beg. They would offer him any amount of money to come back and do his magic. But Elias also knew that some things cannot be fixed with a wave of a wand. They have to be earned. Respect is a slow-growing tree, and Julian had cut it down for firewood. The drive to the coast would take 6 hours. 6 hours of silence for Elias, and 6 hours of sweltering, dark chaos for the elite. He imagined the scene, the investors demanding their money back, the heirs weeping in the dark, the state-of-the-art technology proving itself to be nothing more than a fragile toy. He thought about the lessons he had learned as a young man in post-war Europe, that you never trust a machine you can't fix with your own 2 hands. And you never trust a man who won't look a servant in the eye. He reached into his pocket and felt the master key. It was a heavy, iron thing, forged in a time when things were built to last a century, not a fiscal quarter. He wondered if the heirs even knew what a master key was, or if they thought master was just a password you typed into a box. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a pale gray light over the Atlantic, Elias pulled his truck into the driveway of his small stone cottage. The air here smelled of salt and kelp, a clean, honest scent. He walked to the edge of the cliff and watched the waves crash against the rocks. The ocean didn't care about brands or automation. It followed its own ancient laws, much like the machines Elias had tended for 40 years. He went inside, turned on his old kettle, and finally pulled his phone from his pocket. It was vibrating so hard it nearly jumped out of his hand. 47 missed calls, 32 text messages, 3 voicemails from Julian, his voice cracking with a desperation that sounded nothing like the CEO of the future. "Elias, please. The whole system has collapsed. The investors are threatening to sue. The doors won't open, and the heat is unbearable. Tell us what to do. I'll pay you double, triple. Just tell us how to reset the cooling loop." Elias listened to the message, his face expressionless. He set the phone down on the wooden table and watched the steam rise from his tea. He thought about the way Julian had looked at him the night before, as if he were a piece of trash to be swept away. He thought about the thousands of hours he had given to that family, the birthdays he had missed, the holidays he had spent in the grease pits, all so they could live in luxury. He realized then that he didn't want their money. He didn't even want their apology. He wanted them to feel the weight of their own incompetence. He wanted them to understand that the old man they had discarded was the only thing standing between them and the abyss. He took a slow sip of his tea, the warmth spreading through his chest. For the first time in his life, he was not a servant. He was not a handyman. He was just a man, watching the sea. He knew that the authorities would eventually break the doors down. He knew the company would survive, but its reputation would be in tatters. The merger would fail. And Julian and Beatrice would be forced to answer to a board of directors that had no patience for legacy issues. They would learn that the world is a hard place for those who think they are above the rules of physics and the rules of decency. As he sat there, Elias felt a strange sense of companionship with the waves. They, too, were a constant force, often ignored, until they rose up and reminded the world of their power. He knew his story wasn't over. He knew the twist was yet to come, the document in the Zurich safe deposit box that would change everything. But for now, the silence was enough. He would let them sweat. He would let them wonder. He would let them learn the hard way that when you push away the person who holds everything together, you shouldn't be surprised when it all falls apart. The invisible pillar had walked away, and the world was finally starting to feel the gravity. It is a long way from the Swiss Alps to the coast of Brittany, my friends, but the truth is the same in every language. Never mistake silence for weakness, and never mistake a worn coat for a small soul. The greatest power often resides in the people who don't feel the need to shout about it. Elias looked out at the horizon, where the sky met the water in a perfect, unbreakable line. He was 72 years old, and for the first time, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The heirs thought they had fired him, but in reality, he had simply retired from the business of saving people who didn't want to be saved. And as the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, illuminating the rugged beauty of the coast, Elias smiled. The hard way, it seemed, was the only way left for the world to learn. The darkness inside the Grand Alpine estate was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating shroud that smelled of ozone, expensive sweat, and the bitter tang of scorched circuit boards. My friends, have you ever seen a house of cards fall? It doesn't happen all at once. There is a lean, a shudder, and then a sudden, violent surrender to gravity. In that pitch-black ballroom, the elite of Europe were learning that their global vision was anchored to nothing. The holographic displays that had once shimmered with promises of a digital utopia were now just dead projectors, smelling like a trash fire. Julian and Beatrice, the proud architects of this new era, were no longer the masters of the mountain. They were just two frightened children lost in a cave of their own design, clutching smartphones that had become nothing more than glowing glass bricks. The heat was the most terrifying part. Without the cooling fans, the heat from the subterranean server racks. The brain of the company was rising through the floorboards. The marble, once cool and prestigious, now felt uncomfortably warm to the touch. Guests were stripping off their designer tuxedo jackets. Their silk ties loosened, their faces slick with a sheen of panic. "Open the doors," someone screamed. A voice that belonged to a billionaire who was used to doors opening before he even reached them. But the doors were magnetic. They were smart doors, programmed to lock during a power surge to protect the integrity of the data. Without Elias and his manual override key, the integrity of the data was safe, but the people were trapped in a luxury oven. It was in this moment of peak desperation that a set of headlights cut through the mountain mist outside. A heavy, armored black sedan climbed the road that Elias had descended only hours before. It didn't rattle like Elias's truck. It glided with the silent authority of old. Deep Money, the security guards, fanning themselves with their caps, hurried to the gate. They expected the fire brigade or a team of elite engineers from Zurich. Instead, out stepped a man who looked like he had been carved from the very granite of the Alps. He was tall, silver-haired, and wore a charcoal suit that whispered of centuries of legal battles and silent power. This was Dr. Hans Vogel, the legendary executor of the von Steiger Trust, a man who hadn't been seen in public since the founding grandfather's funeral. Julian, seeing the headlights, managed to force open a small manual ventilation slat in the foyer. "Dr. Vogel," he croaked, his voice cracking with relief. "Thank God. Did you bring the technical team? Did you bring the override codes? The system has crashed, and the international board is inside. This is a catastrophe." Julian was already mentally preparing his excuse, ready to blame the outdated infrastructure that Elias had supposedly left behind. He expected Vogel to snap into action, to call the technicians, to restore the order that Julian believed was his birthright. But Vogel didn't move toward the control room. He didn't even look at the smoking server vents. He simply adjusted his glasses and looked at Julian with an expression of profound, clinical pity. "I didn't bring a technical team, Julian," Vogel said, his voice carrying clearly through the mountain air, cold and precise. "I brought a revelation, and frankly, looking at the state of this place, It's a revelation that has come not a moment too soon. He signaled to his assistant, who pulled a heavy, wax-sealed leather portfolio from the car. I received a notification at midnight. A failsafe was triggered. A physical shim was removed from the primary cooling loop. Do you know what that means? Julian. It means the man who was keeping this family from bankruptcy and physical ruin has finally decided he is finished. And when he finished, the trust agreement changed. Beatrice pushed her way to the vent. Her hair matted to her forehead. What are you talking about? What trust agreement? We are the heirs. We own this company. Just get the doors open so we can fix this mess and find that old traitor Elias. I'll have him in court for sabotage by Monday. She was still trying to use the tools of her world threats, litigation and arrogance, not realizing that the ground had already shifted beneath her. She thought she was fighting a handyman. She didn't realize she was fighting a ghost who had been given the keys to the kingdom while she was still in finishing school. Dr. Vogel stepped closer to the glass, the red emergency lights reflecting in his eyes. You don't own this company, Beatrice. You never did. You were stewards in training. Your grandfather, Maximilian, was a man of immense foresight. He knew that wealth can rot the mind, and that the third generation is usually the one that burns the house down to keep warm. He didn't trust you, and he certainly didn't trust the digital future you were so obsessed with. He trusted the man who stood by his side when the first stone was laid. He trusted the man who knew the soul of the machine. Vogel opened the portfolio and held a document against the glass for them to see. It was yellowed with age but bore a fresh, digital timestamp from the Zurich Central Registry. This is the invisible pillar clause, Vogel explained, his voice like a gavel striking a bench. Maximilian decreed that if Elias Thorne ever felt the need to leave his post because of disrespect, negligence, or the abandonment of the founding principles, the majority voting shares would immediately transfer from the family trust to the executor, me, to be held in favor of a sole beneficiary. Julian felt a coldness in his stomach that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Who? He whispered. Who is the beneficiary? Vogel smiled. A thin, sharp movement of his lips. Elias Thorne. Not only is he the owner of the land this estate sits on, but as of 4 hours ago, he is the majority shareholder of the von Steiger Corporation. You aren't the masters of this house. Julian, you are the guests of a man you just tried to throw out in the snow. The silence that followed was absolute. Inside the ballroom, the investors, the sharks Julian had tried to impress, had heard everything through the open vent. The whispers started instantly, a low hiss of realization. The von Steiger heirs were penniless. They were figureheads who had insulted the true power behind the throne. Sir Alistair, the London investor, let out a dry, hacking laugh from the shadows. Well, Julian, he called out, it seems your legacy issues just became our exit strategy. I look forward to meeting the real CEO. I suspect he has a much better grasp of harmonic resonance than you do. The humiliation was complete. In the dark, in the heat, in the middle of their own celebration. The heirs had been stripped of their masks. But the climax of the night was not just a legal defeat. It was a physical reckoning. As Vogel spoke, a low groan echoed through the building. The vibration that Elias had warned about had reached its breaking point. Without the cooling system, the heat had warped the primary drive shaft of the backup generator. A massive shudder shook the estate, and for a terrifying moment, everyone thought the building might slide off the cliff. It didn't, but the smart locks finally gave way not because they were fixed, but because the control boards had literally melted. The doors slid open with a jagged, screeching sound, releasing a cloud of hot, metallic-smelling air into the night. The guests stumbled out into the mist, coughing and disheveled, their finery ruined. Julian and Beatrice were the last to emerge. Looking like ghosts of their former selves, they stood on the gravel driveway, shivering in the cold. As Dr. Vogel watched them. He's at his cottage on the coast, Vogel said, checking his watch. He's probably having his morning tea. If I were you, I would start walking. You don't have access to the company accounts anymore. And the cars in this lot are all technically property of the corporation, which, as I mentioned, you no longer control. I suggest you go to him, not to demand, not to order, but to beg. Because right now, Elias Thorne is the only person who can keep you from being the most famous failures in European history. It is a long road from the top of a mountain to the bottom of your own pride, isn't it? My friends, Julian and Beatrice looked at the long, winding road that Elias had driven down. They looked at their expensive shoes, never meant for walking on gravel, and then at the dark, silent palace behind them. The great collapse was not just about the power going out. It was about the light finally being shown on the truth. The world had seen them for what they were, empty vessels, and the man they had called a relic was now the only one who could provide them with a map out of the wilderness. The stage was set for the final meeting, a meeting where the grease-stained hands would hold all the cards, and the elite would have to learn the true meaning of the word service. As the sun began to rise over the Swiss peaks, casting a golden light on the ruins of the gala, the irony was inescapable. The heirs had wanted a world without human error, but they had forgotten that humans are the only ones who can provide human grace. Elias had given them 40 years of grace, and they had traded it for a brand. Now, as they started their long walk down the mountain, the weight of the silence was the loudest thing they had ever heard. The invisible pillar had been revealed, and the house he had built was waiting to see if its new master would let it stand or let it fall. The climax had passed, but the lesson, the hard, cold lesson of the coast was just beginning. Think about that for a moment. My friends, we spend our lives building towers, but we forget to thank the people who mix the mortar. We look at the stars and forget the ground beneath our feet. Julian and Beatrice were about to find out that the ground can be very unforgiving when you've spent your life looking down on it. The journey to the coast would be their first real work in 30 years. Every step, every blister, every breath of cold air would be a reminder of the man they had dismissed. And Elias was already there, watching the tide come in, knowing that for the first time in his life, he didn't have to fix anything. He just had to wait for the world to come to him. The mountain was behind them, but the shadow of Elias Thorne grew longer with every hour. The great collapse was complete. The invisible pillar was no longer invisible. He was the horizon itself. And as the heirs trudged toward the valley, they realized that the old ways weren't outdated. They were the only things that were real. The high-tech future had melted in a single night of arrogance, leaving behind nothing but the cold. A hard truth of a legacy built on the back of a man they were never worthy to serve. The road to the coast is a long one when your heart is heavy and your pockets are suddenly empty. For Julian and Beatrice, the journey from the soaring peaks of the Alps to the rugged, salt-sprayed cliffs of Brittany was more than just a physical passage. It was a descent into a reality they had spent their entire lives ignoring. They arrived at the edge of the Atlantic just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold. Their designer clothes were wrinkled and stained with the dust of the road, and their eyes, once sharp with the cold fire of corporate ambition, were now clouded with the frantic exhaustion of the truly desperate. They looked like ghosts haunting the ruins of their own privilege. They found the cottage at the end of a winding dirt path, tucked behind a stand of ancient, wind-bent pines. It was a simple structure of gray stone and weathered wood, looking as if it had grown out of the earth itself. There were no security gates here, no biometric scanners, no high-definition cameras, only a small garden of hardy herbs and the rhythmic, eternal thunder of the waves crashing against the rocks below. It was the kind of place that demanded a certain kind of quietness, a place where the ego feels small against the vastness of the sea. Julian and Beatrice stood at the wooden gate, hesitating. For the first time in their lives, they were standing before a door they couldn't buy, and they were about to speak to a man they had treated as less than human. Elias was sitting on a wooden bench on the porch, a thick wool blanket draped over his legs. He wasn't looking at the path. He was looking at the horizon, where a lone fishing boat was making its way back to the harbor. He held a ceramic mug in his calloused hands, the steam rising in the cool evening air. He looked remarkably different from the man in the grease-stained coat at the gala. Here, in his element, he looked like a king in exile, composed, immovable, and entirely at peace. He didn't turn his head when the gate creaked open. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply waited for the silence to do the work that words usually fail to accomplish. Julian was the first to speak, his voice thin and trembling, stripped of its practiced boardroom authority. Elias, we've been driving for hours. We saw Dr. Fogel, he told us. He told us everything. He paused, waiting for a reaction, a spark of anger, or perhaps a triumphant sneer. But Elias remained as still as the stone walls behind him. The estate is in ruins. Elias, the merger has collapsed. The board is calling for our heads. We didn't know. We didn't know about the trust, or the shares, or what my grandfather intended. We were wrong. We're sorry. The word sorry felt heavy and awkward in Julian's mouth, like a foreign currency he didn't know how to spend. Beatrice stepped forward, her voice high and brittle. Please, Elias, you have to come back. You're the only one who knows how to reset the core logic of the infrastructure. The engineers from Zurich say it's a total loss unless someone can manually bypass the primary resonance dampeners. They're talking about tearing the whole building down. Our legacy, our family name. It's all tied to that mountain. We'll give you anything. A seat on the board. A private jet. 10 times your previous salary. Just save us. She was bargaining now, reaching for the only tools she understood. She thought that if the price was high enough, the invisible pillar would slide back into place. Elias finally turned his head. His eyes were not angry. They were something far more devastating. They were indifferent. You speak of anything, Beatrice, but you have nothing to give, he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of the tides. The salary you offer is paid with money that now belongs to me. The seat on the board is a chair I already own. You offer me the world, not realizing that I am the one who has been holding your world up for 40 years while you played in the attic. You didn't see the man. You only saw the function. And now that the function has stopped, you find yourself in the dark. It is a cold place, isn't it? The dark you made for yourselves. Julian sank onto the steps of the porch, his head in his hands. The realization was finally sinking in, not just the loss of the money, but the loss of his identity. What do you want us to do? He whispered. Do you want us to beg? Do you want to watch us crawl? Elias set his mug down on the small table beside him. I don't want you to crawl. Julian, I want you to walk. I want you to walk back to that village, find the local mechanic, and ask him to teach you how to change a tire. I want you to go to the kitchens in the valley and learn how to wash a dish until your hands bleed. I want you to understand that the grease you mocked is the oil that keeps the world from grinding to a halt. The invisible pillar rose from his chair. Standing tall and straight despite the years of labor, he looked at the two heirs, the children of a man he had loved like a brother, and for a moment, a flicker of sadness crossed his face. Your grandfather didn't leave the company to me because he wanted me to be a billionaire. He left it to me because he knew I was the only one who wouldn't spend it. I am the guardian of the foundation, not the architect of the vanity. The Von Steiger Corporation will be restructured. The profits will no longer go to luxury galas and digital rebranding. They will go to the pensions of the workers you tried to automate out of existence. They will go to the apprentices who still know how to build things with their hands. And us? Beatrice asked, her voice barely a whisper. What happens to us? Elias looked out at the sea one last time. You will be given a small stipend, enough to live in a modest apartment in the valley. You will be given entry-level positions in the logistics department, the real logistics department, in the warehouses, on the docks. If, in 10 years, you have earned the respect of the people who work beside you, then and only then will the trust consider restoring your standing. You thought you were the masters of the machine, but you forgot that a machine is only as good as the heart that tends it. Now, you have a chance to find your own hearts. It is a gift, though I suspect it doesn't feel like one right now. Julian and Beatrice stood in the darkening garden, the weight of their new reality settling over them. There was no more shouting, no more threats, no more arrogance. There was only the sound of the wind and the knowledge that the man they had insulted was the only reason they weren't in a jail cell or on the street. They turned toward the gate, their walk slow and heavy. They didn't have a car anymore. The black sedan that had brought them was gone, reclaimed by the trust. They would have to walk to the village. Just as Elias had suggested, the hard way had begun, and the road back to honor would be a long, steep climb. As the heirs disappeared into the shadows of the pines, Elias sat back down on his bench. He felt the cold air on his face and the warmth of the blanket on his knees. He was a wealthy man now, perhaps one of the wealthiest in Europe. But he still lived in a stone cottage and drank his tea from a chipped mug. The invisible pillar was no longer invisible, but he was still a pillar steady, silent, and true. He had delivered justice, not out of spite, but out of a deep, abiding love for the truth. He had saved the legacy of his friend Maximilian by burning away the dross that had nearly destroyed it. My friends, as we reach the end of this story, I want you to look at the people in your life who seem invisible. The person who cleans the office, the mechanic who keeps your car running, the elderly neighbor who sits quietly on their porch. We live in a world that worships the light, but it is the shadows that hold the structure together. Never judge a soul by the coat it wears or the grease on its hands, for you never know when the world might go dark. And the only person who knows where the switch is located is the person you spent your life ignoring. Elias Thorne spent 40 years being a servant, and in doing so, he became the master of his own destiny. He didn't need a tuxedo to be a gentleman, and he didn't need a title to have power. He only needed his integrity. As the stars began to appear over the Atlantic, Elias closed his eyes and listened to the music of the waves, a symphony far more beautiful than anything that had ever played in the halls of the Von Steiger estate. The world was in balance again. The machines were quiet, the arrogant were humbled, and the honest man was finally at rest. Thank you for walking this path with me today. If this story touched your heart, or if it reminded you of someone who deserves more respect than they receive, I hope you'll carry that feeling with you. Remember, the tallest towers are built from the bottom up, and the most important people are often the ones you have to look down to see. Take care of each other, keep your hands busy and your hearts humble, and never forget that a well-lived life is the best revenge. If you enjoyed this journey into the heart of justice and the strength of the human spirit, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this story with someone who needs to hear it. Let us know in the comments. Have you ever seen someone's true power revealed when they were underestimated? Your stories are the pillars of this community. Until next time, I am ANH Trey Zero Minus, and I'll be here, waiting to tell you another tale of the extraordinary people hidden in our ordinary world. Goodbye for now, and may your foundation always be strong.